Hello,
Yes,
everyone.
you're live.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another DML Commons Salon. It's May 28th, and we're here for the fourth unit of the design-based research strand of the DML Commons series, hosted by the DML Hub. This is the second salon of our unit on critiques of design-based research and responses from the field. This week, we have Mina Norris, Vanessa Svehla, and Caitlin Martin joining the DML Commons, this time to discuss their own experiences on the ground, in the field, with thinking about the challenges and limitations of design-based research. In this salon, they will share some of their own experiences, their stories, perspectives, and we'll invite questions from those of you out there listening. My name is Peter Wardrip, and I'm a researcher at the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh, and I'm co-facilitating the salon with Nick Wilson, a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford University. Nick and I are super excited to have Amina, Caitlin, and Vanessa join us for today's salon. But before we jump in, let's have everyone introduce themselves for our audience. Nick, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks for that introduction. You sort of hit the nail on the head. So I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Stanford University. My background as it relates to design-based research is actually kind of limited. Most of my research has been in schools, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I've been a designer of learning environments. So I'm actually very curious to hear from our panel here about what their experiences has been as I've been sort of trying to get more involved with actually designing curricular interventions and iterating on those designs with folks in schools.
Great. Great. Amina, would you like to say something bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Peter, and also thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to participate. My name is Mina Norris. I am currently the Director of Education and Research for the Representation Project, which is an international media literacy organization. Before that, my own research was more qualitative based, but currently I've created curriculum for the organization that will be used in schools, and so we're in the process of developing a research study, a design-based research study, and so my participation here is kind of, this is really very close to us beginning the intervention, which will start next fall. So I have more sort of done a lot of reading about it and reviewing other people's work as opposed to actually doing my own. So thus far.
Great. Fantastic. I'm glad you could join us. Caitlin?
Hi, I'm Caitlin Martin, and I'm currently a researcher at the Digital Youth Network in Chicago, working with Nicole Pinkard and Denise Neku. And I have been involved with some elements of design-based research for about 10 years, starting working with Bridget Barron, and both in school environments and in informal environments, like after-school programs and community centers. And for the most part, it sort of started out as curricular design and implementation, but it really has changed in the work we're doing now at Digital Youth Network is looking at the design of online systems and how those are used in different sorts of learning environments, both formal and informal. So that's primarily the work we're doing now.
Great. Thanks for joining us. And Vanessa?
Hi, I'm Vanessa Svehla. I'm an assistant professor in Organization, Information, and Learning Sciences at the University of New Mexico, and I direct the IDEA Lab. I guess I've been involved in design-based research since sometime in 2006. I actually took the class taught by Phil Bell. I was visiting at University of Washington, and that's where I got started in it. And I have a sort of long-standing project that's been DBR that started there and has continued to some new territories and new settings. I'm interested in design-based research, I guess, as a designer. I do some fashion design, and so I bring that lens to my work to understand whether or not design-based research has design in it. So that's my interest, I guess.
Great, and thanks for joining us. Finally, to those of you that are joining us via the web, before we get started, we should mention this, that you can use our Etherpad to follow along with our discussion and post questions for the panel. The link for this is, listen carefully, etherpad.mozilla.org/DML Commons Unit 4 DBR. Give a proper pause for that. You can also follow along our Twitter back channel using the hashtag DMLCommons. And while we're getting settled, feel free to enter your name, institutional affiliation, and Twitter handle under the roll call section of the Etherpad. All right. I think some people might be adding. Excellent. So why don't we get started? I'll at least start by tossing out some questions to you guys, and whoever feels sort of the fervor to respond first can take the lead. I think our first question is, in your experiences with DBR or DBR projects, what have been some of the criticisms or critiques, methodological critiques that you've experienced, either from yourself or from others as you're presenting the work?
Yeah, I think that the largest kind of critique that I found is that it's not really grounded in methodology, and it's not really clear, because as you're trying to develop, you're sort of developing on the fly. So I think it's easier to understand, or if you have a set goal in terms of a method, it's easier to implement that way, as opposed to sort of doing something and then saying, oh, well, maybe there's some difficulty, maybe this isn't working, and then changing. So I think that's the biggest critique that I've come across.
To build on that, first of all, I just wanted to point out, yes, we totally have that issue too. And I don't know if you guys have found this, but recently we've had a lot of IRB issues that have come up too because of that, because the methods are not in place. I can't give them my set of tools at the beginning of the project and have them not change for a year. It's constantly evolving, and that's been sort of a related struggle with design-based research, is getting your sort of IRB behind you and understanding what you're trying to do. Another big one for us has been the big criticism of how do you, and we've found ways to kind of work around this, but how do you develop profiles and really, really understand environments without your results sounding so descriptive and like an anecdotal story, as opposed to something that you can tie to a larger framework or structure, and sort of the balance between doing that is difficult.
Yes.
Definitely. Do you find, Caitlin, I'm just curious, do you find sort of the critiques and challenges similar with your design work on online systems versus, I don't know, offline, or whatever the contrast is?
I think so, and maybe it's because of the methods we're using within the DBR are similar, and so the results we're getting are similar. The way we're going into these environments and looking at the thing that's being used and designed, whether it's an online system or a curriculum, it's been the same set of ways we're going about doing it, and so the same sorts of stories that are developing, that need, the more you understand about an environment, the more there is to explain and describe, and how not to get weighted down with that story and instead be able to zoom out is something that has been challenging across projects, I think.
Sorry, Caitlin, but I want to follow up on your IRB question too. So, because I think it's something we all struggle with, not being able to sort of manipulate our tools over the course of a year, or anticipate how we might want to manipulate them. And so have you come up with any sort of strategies to mitigate that?
I think part of it is sort of an educative strategy. So there's a difference in terms of different IRB institutions. So working at Stanford, I think they just had more experience with other people doing similar sorts of things, and so they were more flexible in what they required in order to give approval, and the number of times I needed to come back to update in a way that they were satisfied with, versus an institution that doesn't really have a lot of this sort of thing going on, and it's totally new to them, and they don't really understand why I would even be suggesting that my tools might change or my questions might change. And so I think part of it is really, again, it's like the time component of why this is so hard is really having to sit down and have long meetings with IRB officers about what we're doing and why it's important and why these methods do have to emerge as part of the study as opposed to some set of tools or questions at the beginning.
Vanessa, have you, I'm curious, maybe now, but maybe more so when you first went to New Mexico, did you face the problem of being sort of a pioneer in employing design-based research for your investigations? And if so, how did you deal with that?
Yeah. So I don't think anyone else was doing DBR here, but there are a lot of people doing community-engaged work. Mm-hmm. I think our IRB still hadn't kind of realized that there was a whole paradigm wars thing that happened a while ago and that qualitative data were data. So actually initially a few people who came in around the time I did managed to get, I'm going to videotape my class every week and treat that as data through as an exempt IRB, because qualitative data obviously aren't data. And so for a little while it was easygoing, and then it became very difficult when the folks doing a lot of community engaged work and participatory work said, no, this is a thing, and this is an important thing, and this is an important thing in the context in which we work. And I think design-based research should partner up with community engaged research to kind of say, hey, we do a lot of the same stuff. You know, not always, but we have a lot of the same issues. We face many of the same issues. And I think we would benefit. And I think we see that in the DBIR work, which looks a lot more like community engaged work, that these challenges of, yeah, it's going to change. We don't even know, like, if there's a question here that I have the expertise to answer. That really makes your kind of ed psych or, you know, classic, I just do big social science stats work, people very nervous. They don't know how to evaluate it. I'm from an IRB standpoint.
Yeah, right. I guess it occurs to me that, I mean, when we think about critiques for any sort of approach, and in the case of DBR, we might think of the critiques coming from, you know, scientists that engage in large-scale RCTs and critique the boutique nature of it, for example. But I'm curious, critiques come from a variety of places, and I'm curious if all of you guys are committed to working with participants rather than on. And I'm just curious if the communities within which you work, do you receive or do you hear any sort of critiques about your approach from the participants or the people you collaborate with?
Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say yes. Just last week, we actually had a collaborative design workshop with a set of teachers, some of which are the educators in whose classes we've been working for the last 2 years. But we also invited other educators who work with online technology in their classrooms or informal environments to come and sort of design with us. And the teachers who we've been working with, of course, almost weekly we have conversations with them, and we're sort of sharing our theoretical view of what we're asking questions about, and they're sharing what's going on and what they think about the design. But in inviting more people, we really wanted a richer dialogue of people using online systems in general, and just to throw a lot of people into co-design work was not an easy thing to do, and some of the criticisms were that the kind of ivory tower criticism of, there's one person who I think said something like, "This is really interesting, but it's clear you guys are doing work from within a cave." And I was thinking, wait, but we're the ones who are doing this collaborative design. And so definitely that even in the communities in which you're trying to really engage as co-designers, still that criticism of you as researchers are leading and sort of have these theoretical ideas that aren't quite what we're doing in the day-to-day, and that separation, even in a practice that's supposed to be much more linking the two together, and that was hard.
Yeah, I was going to say that, so in my earlier research, I actually was a graduate student researcher on this project where it was a design-based research project where they were implementing like math fractions, supplementary lessons into elementary school classrooms. And it was, I wouldn't say that there was so much of a critique from the teachers per se, but I think that the teachers really appreciated the ability and the opportunity to actually have reflection on their actual practice. And I think that's one of the things that teachers really appreciate about, this type of research, that you're implementing something and you get to see, if it's working or not, like right there, and change it. And so, and in my own sort of later, I tried to implement in sort of my own research, even though it was qualitative, it wasn't specifically design-based, but that kind of process by which, like, after I would do sort of like a participant observation of classroom, and then do a follow-up interview immediately after, and then teachers would be questioning like, oh, like I didn't even remember that I said that, or or oh, I did that, or and across the because when they're in the actual process of facilitating, it's it's very, or teaching, you may not necessarily know or see things that as a participant observer I could see, and so they really very much valued the opportunity to be able to reflect on their practice right there, right then and there, and I could see the actual process by which that actually informed future practice, so that they were much more aware of how they would, institute something based on, that the ability to actually have that. The problem then for us as researchers is that it becomes this question of, are we actually influencing practice, because we're supposed to be observing it. So it becomes this really difficult situation by which you don't want to actually influence the setting that you're actually supposed to be observing, but then in a lot of ways you do, because it's, especially if you see something that is, questionable. So that you're like, oh. So it's a very dicey sort of situation that arises.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll respond to that as well. Mike, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think two things. The first is that I try to, I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, and so I try to help people have access to the research I'm doing by using as little jargon or technical terminology as I can to really narrow that lexicon as much as possible, and to make sure that we've developed a shared understanding around it, so that, ideally, I want the students that I'm studying, the teachers that I'm studying, to have some sort of understanding of the work that I'm doing, and that that they feel they can mark when they think they've seen it or seen it happen. And that carries across from the more design-based research that I do to the more ethnographic kind of work that I do. And so one thing I do is what I call an interdisciplinary vulnerability exercise. So basically, if I'm meeting with a team, and usually these are co-researchers, and they're not learning scientists, at the end of that, I'll ask everyone to write from each other's points of view what it is, as if they are me, as if I'm them, and then we have a good laugh, and we value each other's point of view and contributions. And so that's with co-researchers, right? Like, if someone's not willing to try to say what it is that I do, and I'm not willing to say what it is that I think they do, then we haven't spent enough time listening to each other. And then I try to, when I go into a setting, I do try to help the participants understand what kinds of things I'm looking for. And I know I've had change. That means we change absolutely the places that we do our work in, but by documenting those changes. So if I present some of my work to participants, and I try to present it in ways that are accessible to them, and let me do a little member checking as well. I find that I have to really document that process of presentation because, you know, like one setting that I work in, it's an interdisciplinary science lab, and now they consider themselves to be designers. And they use that, they'll call out, oh, we're designing right now. And they didn't do that before I presented to them about, you know, what I was seeing in their work. And so I think the more that we can document our impact, it becomes part of the design instead of trying to have something that's very tidy and clean. I guess I'd rather have a sense of, you know, what is it, how do we help them become articulate informants on the process? Because I want them to be able to push back and say, like, yeah, you think you're studying this, but you know, that's not how we see it. I want that voice, you know, to be in there.
I have a question, actually, Vanessa, as a follow-up, and for Amina and Caitlin, maybe you could jump in on this too. So with what you were just saying, I wonder if there was any pushback from, not from your co-participants in that, you know, design setting or that research setting, but any pushback from other environments, so like academia or departments, you know, that you work for at your university or your institution, that sort of, you know, try to say, like, look, there's a certain type of research, or there's a certain type of, there's maybe a line as a designer in getting involved with these, you know, with a community, and, you know, they sort of like hold you to that in terms of like either your publications or reports or something like that, as opposed to sort of getting really down on the ground with your co-participants in your design setting.
Sure. You know, I think this varies across university. For me, I'm pretty lucky. I've got, well, one of the reasons I came to University of New Mexico is I knew that I would be able to do the kind of research that I wanted to do, that the expectations were, people were open to interdisciplinary work that might be a little less coherent. I certainly, or that might appear less coherent to an outsider. You know, it's certainly something I consider that I'll have to navigate going up for tenure, to talk about like how my work fits together, and it's taken some turns and twists along the way. You know, it's emergent, and I'm probably overly comfortable with emergence in my work, but I think it strengthens it. I think the cross-pollination that's possible across disparate areas really enriches it and makes me happy. If I can't get tenure doing what I love, I don't really want it. And that may be a bold statement, but I don't want to become something that I don't want to become just to get tenure. I want to do stuff that I really love. I think in terms of publication, so if you document your design work quite well, and you really make note of design decisions, I often audio record design meetings. I consider all of those things to be data. and you can publish on that too. I mean, there are spaces where you can analyze your own design process and work with that. So I think having, I don't know, having some kind of other access to data when the design process is slow is good. So, you know, you're kind of setting yourself up by documenting all of that design work. So you are doing recognizable research. But there's also the education of colleagues. I think part of the work I do is the education of colleagues, and so so I have this kind of like blanket statement of, you know, this is design-based research, the hallmark research method of the learning sciences, and then I put a bunch of citations to foundational work and a bunch of citations to recent work, and I just try to stand by that. So that's like a power play.
Yeah, I would say I also would echo when I was at UC Berkeley, I definitely felt that sense of support for the research that I did, and it is a growing field, and I think there's a lot of people who at Berkeley definitely were supportive of it, in support of it. Now that I am sort of bridging this gap between being a researcher and a practitioner, developing my own curriculum outside of the academy, and trying to also stay sort of connected to the academy. I think it's you know, it's hard. I would also say in terms of just involvement, and I did see a question about this in terms of youth input on our research. I think when I was doing my initial research, it was definitely something that I developed on my own, and then with more teacher, I would say, input. And now that I'm doing something, I definitely need youth input and youth advice. And so, so for example, we created this what we call, we're calling it a hashtag Beyond the Mask, which is we have this new film out called The Mask You Live In, and so as a part of it, we're doing this quizzes where young people can sort of look at male characters and like select your favorite male character from a video, television show or film, video game, and so they can do quizzes. So we had an impromptu focus group with male high school students who were like, you know, giving us feedback on the quiz, saying, hey, this is, you know, well, some of the feedback was like, hey, you know, this is too much like school. So we needed to be, you know, because we actually graded them. So like, you know, and that was questionable. They were like, why are you grading us? You know, if this is our favorite, we shouldn't receive a grade for it. You know, like, but it was actually the thought behind it was we're grading the characters. So like, is this character a good role model or not? So the questions would be like, you know, does he use drugs and alcohol to numb his pain, for example? Does he use violence? Use violence, but only, you know, in self-defense as opposed to like to solve all problems? But the students were like, or the young people were like, hey, you know, this is too much like school. We don't want to be graded for, like, especially if we really like them, if we like this character, and you're telling us, oh, this person gets an F, like he's not a good role model at all. What are we supposed to do? So that then, you know, feeds into like the revisions that we have to make onto the quiz, so that it will be something that young people would, you know. So there's a sort of give and take, and I think that process is good, but it means a lot more work, and there's difficulty in that, I would say.
To add on, there are a couple questions now going around, I feel like, but in terms of the pushback from institutions, I've not had that happen, and I think it's because of the people who I've been working with, Bridget and Nicole, who have really paved the way at their institutions for being so hands-on and so in the environment themselves, and that's such a big part of their work. And sort of alluding to what Vanessa said, like they care about what they're doing and the designs and the environments and caring deeply about understanding what's going on in those places, which means getting really involved. And I absolutely back up that need for just constant documentation of what you're doing. Being in the moment, absolutely, and then going right outside that room and documenting everything that just happened, recording everything you can to be able to talk about exactly what you're doing, but to be really involved, I think, is an important part of this. And then in terms of that as well, really having that youth co-design partners, I think, is critical, and that's a lot of the work that we're doing right now at DYN, working with educators to figure out their intentions behind using these networked systems, but also working with the kids not only to see how they're using it, but to see what they're coming into this learning environment, from what perspective, so learning about them through pretty intensive case studies of youth, what their home environment is like, which other kind of community centers are they using, what are they coming to this networked environment, expertise, resources, family members, sort of how does it all connect, and getting them to talk to us through individual interviews, but also we do classroom focus groups, helping us to design unique features of the system, and just a ton of field observations. That's a lot of participant observation, really using the system with them, seeing how it's playing out in class, and getting them to articulate what they're doing, why, and how they're thinking about it.
Great. You know, just to build on that youth involvement aspect, I'm just curious if any of you would like to add if there's anything specific you try to do to manage the process so it's beneficial to both you and the youth. I mean, it's in many examples we can think about how their input and involvement is beneficial to us because it's sort of like usability type testing. Mm-hmm. But involving them so that there's some sort of tangible or intangible benefit for them in the process. Like
Vanessa was saying about the educator she was working with, seeing themselves as designers, these kids have absolutely picked up on that. And it wasn't necessarily an intention, but they were working with a group of middle school girls on the south side of Chicago, and we're co-developing a set of stories that go in an online system that are encouraging them to work through some of the computational making curriculum that Kylie Pepler's team developed. And they, you know, little prompts have just snowballed and turned them into these girls who are very, very comfortable giving design implications and talking about design of narratives and complex systems in ways that have been really exciting to watch. So I think that sense of agency in design is really incredible. And also, just working with middle school and high school kids for a number of years, that sense of being taken as an individual student and having the time to reflect on yourself and your learning is something that doesn't happen a lot in schools. And I think that sort of these moments to discuss with an adult or a small group things, questions that don't have answers, maybe, you know, that aren't just test questions but real thoughtful reflection questions, is sometimes a really unique and fun opportunity for kids.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest sort of issues that I found in my research was this these young people who were not interested. They weren't interested in participating. They weren't interested in, you know, the process. They were kind of divested from it, and a lot of it had to do with the issues of their own privacy, speaking public, you know, sharing specifically with design thinking, like their own personal experiences in a public forum, like a classroom or a space or something like that. And then also this notion of sort of critical literacy, meaning that they would actually have a voice in creating whatever it was that they were doing, as opposed to it being a prompt that was a teacher-based prompt or something that was, outside of and they felt, forced upon them. So, so that knowledge has been really sort of instrumental in my work in terms of wanting and needing to feel like I'm not doing, kind of doing the same things that I've found in my research to be problematic, and it's difficult because I don't want to assume that I have, or like what I'm creating is the end all be all, I want it to be an iterative process by which they're able to provide feedback and then that feedback actually will influence the actual product that they receive, the curriculum that they're going to be getting. And so that makes it really incumbent upon me to continue to have, focus group discussions and have youth advisors that, provide feedback on stuff, and then actually making sure that we're cutting across, different demographics so that we're not constantly speaking to the same kids with the same giving the same kids, because I think we have this, in the kind of DML community, we have this kind of fictional kid that we've identified, and this kid is innovative, and this kid is, typically white, and this kid is typically, have some sense of affluence to himself, and he's a male, and so, and I think that is, highly problematic. I find it highly problematic. And so what I've constantly try to do is sort of say, okay, we can't create kids, fictitious or real, or try and make these fictitious children into like the real kids that we are dealing with on a daily basis. So creating that sort of or embedding that equitable sort of idea into the work is really something that I'm highly passionate about, and making this work something that is increasingly equitable is something that I think we all need to be passionate about. So but it's difficult, and I wouldn't say that we're going to be able to reach all children, but I think that there needs to be an effort to do that.
And I think there's that tension between the reaching all children and being contextual. And it's a hard tension hard space to dance in, because if we look at like the common guidelines for doing educational research, we see this assumed natural progression to scale. Yeah. And I think there are things that scale, absolutely. I mean, we all love our iPhones, or phones that look an awful lot like iPhones but aren't, and so that's that's something that scales, and so there certainly are things that scale, but I think the difficulty is going from kind of doing that careful contextual work that lets us understand what our participants' needs are. When I go in ethnographically, trying to really do a needs assessment, and that guides a lot of the design decisions that I make. But I draw that from a design tradition rather than from a design-based research tradition, typically. But then, so if I make something, right, and this is the boutique quality of I'm going to try it out in this one space and see how it works and learn something in that space. There is this assumption that then we should just start going to scale, and that we might have, or that we would have as people who do small scale work, the requisite skill set to go to scale. And I don't know that that's a great assumption. In that space, there's this move for generalizability, and there's always this pressure from past traditions that we should aim at generalizability, and I don't really think we should. I think we should aim at transferability, and that's where I think context continues to stay in our work, to be very close. So if I'm talking about, if I'm writing about my work, what I should be attending to is where do I think it's brittle when it moves to another setting? Where do I think it might be robust and why? And providing some of that thick description work to help people understand and navigate moving that to a new place. But I think kind of the other sort of piece in there that's very hard in doing that sort of iterative, really contextual design work is if we are doing design, then we're keeping the problem space open until it's designed. And that's, again, that comfort with emergence and ambiguity that designers have to have. That if I'm designing something and I'm really bringing in other perspectives, other participant perspectives, that problem is actually shifting as long as I'm still designing. And it's not really a problem that's known until the solution is known. And then when we bring it to a new setting or a new context, it's a new problem, and not treating it as the problem being generalizable somehow. So it's very important, I think, that we work in diverse settings, that we're not just aiming at the affluent white folk. I think we're rather boring, and so I would like to see us work in much more interesting spaces, personally.
To build on that, I was, one of the criticisms is this idea that DBR there's a selection bias. You're going into an environment, and sometimes you're going into the easiest or the most accessible environment, and that is more often the affluent white communities. So there's this opportunity to actually use that selection bias to seek out these environments that are more difficult and with a wider variety of learners. But I just wanted to bring up a kind of an issue that we've faced recently and see if people have any feedback. So we have one tool that we're developing, but the tool is used in a bunch of different types of settings. And so we purposefully are looking at the use of the same tool across different learning environments. So one environment is a middle school, during school, English language arts classroom. The kids are primarily Latino, and the other environment is an after-school program, girls learning about technology and circuitry. And so in using these in two different contexts has been super fascinating, and we have the educators as co-designers and the students as co-designers. But then it's in our design and trying to figure out the best next moves to reach that solution, they look different. And the way people even understand the systems are completely different. And so we keep looking at this idea of adaptability, or kind of the ability to change a bunch of different things about the system when you go in to start, but then at what point does that just become overly complicated and all of a sudden you have a system that's not even usable? And so that tension between trying to look across environments to extract those things that are consistent and maybe scalable and maybe principles that could be applied more broadly, but if you're going to really attend to those unique environments, how to not get differing opinions about what the right solution is, how to deal with that.
Yeah, I think maybe Vanessa's answer I felt was a great sort of response to the question that you just raised. But I do think that there's this issue of like having something like, for example, the curriculum that we're creating, right? It's going to be literally used by thousands of young people. So I'm not going to be able to then say, well, I'm going to change every, lesson for every, I'm not going to be able to do that. But what I can do is say, okay, I'm taking in the feedback, and I think it would be like any kind of thing that you're adapting, right? You're taking the feedback and you sort of have to then kind of streamline and say, okay, this is what, this, I think, feels like it's honoring what people are telling me, but then not necessarily losing the gist of what I'm trying to do. I also think that it's important for us to decide at some point, like maybe we're altering for specific settings, like because there's different problems that we may be addressing in different communities or what have you. So we may just specifically have something that's just for that, you know, particular community, and that's fine too. So I think there's I think that's a question of us being able to kind of adapt, saying, and I love the idea Vanessa raised about just making things contextual and saying, okay, you know, everyone isn't going to have this. Every community is not going to have the same response to the design, what we created, and so we are going to, and that's where the qualitative aspect of this work becomes really beautiful to me and really rich, is being able to take in how it is that a specific community responds to something that we've created, and make adaptations based on that for that community, and not necessarily assume that will, you know, what's going to work in Oakland is not necessarily even going to work in San Francisco. You know.
There's something sort of in the background that you guys are talking about that was prompted by Amina, and I just wanted to bring this up just in case you guys had a response to it. So what assumptions, when you guys are sort of approaching a context, let's just say in a general sense, what sort of assumptions do you guys have to grapple with, or have you had to grapple with in your work? And I think there are assumptions that you bring that you have to potentially grapple with when you think about the people you're working with, but then there's also the assumptions of the people you're working with. And you guys actually sort of implicitly have talked about this a little bit, but I'm curious if you guys have a direct response to that.
I'll give some examples from my work on interactive learning assessments. You know, I think we made some assumptions about what, when we were first designing the interactive learning assessments, it was on the topic area was genetic counseling. And we brought in the genetic counselor assuming she'd catch our mistakes, which she did. But we were thinking of them as, you know, sort of content mistakes. And, you know, she caught us in some pretty big assumptions about what genetic counselors actually do. And so it was really good having that. It gave me a commitment to having the expertise in the room that you really need. But I think as that work's progressed and gone into new settings, one of the things I've learned to deal with is when working with collaborators who maybe are university faculty, but not in education, you know, they've come through the natural sciences or what have you, that they're in it with you in part potentially because they care about their teaching, but they may be relatively uninformed about how learning happens, and so you end up, I think, facing a lot of, you know, the kinds of things that you might get in some professional development for faculty, learning styles and clickers and flipped classrooms and all of that, and a shallow understanding of the work we do. And so I think over time I've developed a number of resources that I can provide to share some basics about the work we do to help them navigate the assumptions they might have and bring about what would support learning. But I think one of the things I've just resigned myself to is sometimes you have to let them design something bad or test something bad out so they can get out of their system and move on. And I think that's a really valuable learning experience that you can, again, documenting sort of everything that potentially becomes a paper just in looking at the transformation that can occur when someone, you know, some teacher or instructor is testing out their beliefs and assumptions about learning and growing with you as they're designing and being a part of the design process.
Yeah, so one of the things that I have an assumption that I learned from my dissertation research that I kind of am carrying and employing, and it's this idea of, I'm assuming that resistance to learning, and that is actually, and that within resistance there can actually be an opportunity. So that's an assumption that I'm making, and so when I see any aspect of resistance coming from young people where they're not, they don't want to do it, or they're speaking back to it, or they're kind of protesting, or they what have you, then I have to assume that there's some reason for that. They're actually employing, I call what it a resistance strategy. So there's different strategies that young people employ to where they don't have to participate, and those strategies can include sort of like absenteeism, talking back, putting your head down. So there's different strategies that young people may employ, and I have to, I say in my work that within that, you're looking at those strategies, that there's some opportunity in that for learning, and that what it is that, and also for unlearning. So I think that when young people have appropriated some negative self-concepts that have been fed to them, then that can also feed into sort of their identity processes, which then would make them not want to participate in certain aspects of or activities. And so what I'm trying to do is find ways to develop opportunities to kind of get to what, the root of why it is that a young person would employ a resistance strategy, or that young people would employ resistance strategies, and then to kind of then be able to develop a process by which learning can occur, or unlearning can occur depending on the situation. But it is that is a core assumption that I'm trying to implement, that I think is really valuable. The other thing is that I think that what has happened is that, as I said, I think that the learning community that we're involved in has an assumption, and so a lot of my work is just trying to refute that, because I just feel like that's problematic, as I said before. So I feel like we need to kind of question our assumptions about who it is that we're working with. What are these communities? Understanding that how are they making meaning is maybe different, and I think that's a definite ethnographic idea, and I think we should promote that, as opposed to assuming like that every community should if they're not learning this one way, or they're not making meaning the way that we assume they should be, that there's something wrong with them, or they're bad, or they're, what have, so there's a lot of, or ignoring them. And I think that's a huge problem that as I started, looking into the DBR, was just basically a lot of communities have just been ignored. In terms of the research, because we assume that will be too problematic for what I want to do, so I'm just not going to do any research with them.
Great. Thanks, guys. So I have maybe I have time for one more question, because it seems like these questions so far are greatly generative. Thanks. So I'm curious how. So in response, certainly to your just experience engaging in DBR over a course of years, but also in response to potential critiques that either you've experienced or you've had through self-reflection, I'm curious how your guys' approach has evolved over time. Potentially in response to these critiques, but also in response to the natural challenges that it might present for you.
So
go ahead. Sorry, I was like waiting for, because I just spoke, so I was like, let somebody else talk. Yeah, I think that my approach has evolved basically as I alluded to before. It's just sort of employing that assumption about what it is, my understanding of like resistance strategies that young people may invoke during the act of like, and actually finding ways to sort of respond to that by involving more youth input into what I do. So I think that has fostered me to employ more like focus groups and youth advisors and things in my work, as opposed to previously it would, I think I had initially when I thought about DBR was more like educator focused, like, you know, my relationship to the educators and interviewing them and so on and so forth, as opposed to now it's like I see it as much more of a an effort that is it's critical to have, you know, multiple voices, including youth voice and educator voice and, you know, and researcher voice. So
I think I've become increasingly committed to bringing designerly perspectives into my work in DBR. And I guess in part, you know, what I mean by that is, I think I was initially taken, as many of us seem to be, there's peer pressure around generating design principles and things like that. And I don't think that we really use design principles in the learning sciences the way designers use design principles. And I don't think we would find them very useful if we use them the way designers use them. But I think really starting from needs in the world and viewing that sort of, you know, theory and practice as very overlapping, you know, the sort of classic, there's nothing more practical than theory, nothing more theoretical than practice, you know, maintaining that stance in the work. And so going into a place and being very open and comfortable with the problem remaining open throughout the process, and not seeing it as a, you know, a fixed end goal that has to be my goal. It's hard, I think, to maintain that stance, but I don't want to just create design principles and have that be the main contribution, because I think they need to be and remain contextual. And the kind of step from theory through design, I think, is largely one of style and skill set and our understanding of context, and our willingness to invite others into understanding context and design with us. And so I guess over time I've developed a stronger commitment to just being very designerly in my work.
One strategy that we have employed is to really incorporate quantitative as well as the DBR, and really using things that we have available to us like log data through these systems. And we do a lot of survey work too of entire communities, so that when we go deep with certain participants, we really can ground that in these larger patterns that we see. And it's one way to make that adjustment for the anecdotal story problem, is to have these big patterns and then go deep into people within different, who have shown different patterns in these learning environments or in reaction to the curriculum. And it helps my understanding of even what questions to ask, seeing that broader data and then drilling down into it with these case stories. And sometimes it's easier to explain to it's a good way to get people sort of into that deeper, richer contextual stuff if you kind of show that high-level picture. And we found that in any presentations to funders or people that maybe don't have the DBR or learning sciences background.
Great, thanks, guys. Is there any, I want to make sure, in case you guys need to give a last word, is there anything else that you guys, before we wrap this up, any point that might have gotten glossed over that you think is worth going back to? Give my 5-second wait time. Or go ahead.
I think we should teach design in the learning sciences. That's it.
All right. Great. Well, anything else? No. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Amina, Caitlin, Vanessa, super interesting. And for those of you following along at home, after we're done, I encourage you to go to the Etherpad or go to Twitter and continue the conversations. And thank you very much for listening and engaging in these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.